There was a way that mornings used to begin in this country. And if you grew up before 1980, you know exactly what it sounded like before you even open your eyes to remember it. It sounded like a percolator. Not the hiss of a machine or the beep of a timer, but the particular gurgling bubble of coffee working its way up through the stem and spreading across the glass top, brown and darkening, the smell reaching the bedroom before anyone had said a word. The morning had a structure to it that held the whole day together. The paper was on the porch, the radio was on low, breakfast was made from scratch, eggs in a pan and toast under the broiler, and the clothes were laid out and the shoes were by the door because everything that needed doing in the morning had been prepared the night before by someone who understood that mornings did not have time for improvisation. After breakfast, the day's work began in the order it had always begun. Monday was wash day. Not because someone had decided Monday was wash day, but because Monday had always been wash day, and the rhythm of the week was organized around it the way a song is organized around its beat. Every backyard on the block had a clothesline, and on Monday mornings they were all in use, and the sight of an entire neighborhood's sheets moving in the same morning wind was the kind of thing nobody thought to photograph because it was simply what Monday looked like. That morning is gone as completely as anything on this list. And if you were of a certain age, you woke up inside it for years without knowing it was something you would one day miss. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now and tell us what is the first thing you remember about your mornings growing up. We read every single one.
The telephone sat in one place. It did not come with you. It did not follow you from room to room or buzz in your pocket or light up on the nightstand while you were trying to sleep. It sat on a table in the hallway or on the kitchen wall, and when it rang, you went to it. Dialing a number on a rotary phone was a physical act that required patience. You put your finger in the hole, you pulled the dial to the stop, you waited for it to return, and then you did it again for the next digit. A 7-digit number took several seconds and could not be rushed, and if you made a mistake on the 6th digit, you hung up and started over. There was no backspace. Before direct dialing existed in your area, there was an operator. You picked up the phone and a woman's voice said, "Number, please," and you gave her the number and she connected you. In small towns, she sometimes knew which numbers belonged to which families, and there are entirely true stories of people calling the operator not with a number but with a name and being connected anyway. The party line was a single telephone line shared by 2, 4, or 8 households. When you picked up to make a call, you might find your neighbor already on the line, mid-conversation, and you would wait, or, if it was urgent, interrupt, which was considered extremely poor form, and which your neighbor would remember. The party line was also, and everyone understood this implicitly, a source of neighborhood information that no one officially acknowledged. People memorized phone numbers because the number lived in your head rather than in a device. You knew your own number, your parents' number, your best friend's number, your grandmother's number. They were there, available without searching. And the personal address book, a small spiral-bound notebook in a drawer beside the phone, held the rest. If you lost it, you had lost the accumulated record of your social world, and you rebuilt it by calling everyone you could remember and asking for their number again. The telephone cord stretched as far as it could stretch, and never quite far enough. Teenagers pulled it around corners and sat on the floor with their backs against the wall, talking in low voices about things they did not want their parents to hear, which their parents heard anyway because the house was not large and the cord only went so far. When you left the house, you were unreachable, and this was not considered a crisis. You told someone where you were going and approximately when you would be back, and then you went. And while you were simply gone, present wherever you were, available to no one who was not also there. Long distance was expensive enough to be rationed. A call from Ohio to California cost real money, the kind that made you think carefully about what you needed to say before you dialed, because the meter was running and the conversation had a budget. People wrote letters for long distance because letters did not cost by the minute. The payphone booth had doors that folded shut, and inside was a small shelf, a chained phone book with half its pages missing, and the smell of a small enclosed space that had been used by the public for 20 years. You needed a dime, later a quarter, and the number memorized or written on a piece of paper. There was no other way to have it. The phone book arrived every year and replaced the previous years, and the previous years went into the recycling or under the short leg of a table. It was a document of genuine civic importance, the weight of it, the thin pages, every business and every household in a 50-mile radius organized into a book you could actually hold. There was no other way to search, and the search required knowing at least approximately how to spell what you were looking for. A phone call was an event in a way that no notification has ever managed to be. When the phone rang in the evening, everyone in the room knew it, because it rang out loud in the room, and whoever answered it carried the news back to whoever was waiting. Good news traveled that way, bad news traveled that way. The ring of the phone was something you felt before you answered it. The rotary phone is gone. The operator is gone. The party line is gone. What replaced them is more capable in every measurable way and has cost us something in every unmeasurable one. What number do you still have memorized from your childhood? Leave it in the comments. Not the number itself, but whose number it was. We want to know.
The milkman came before anyone was awake. He carried the bottles in a wire carrier, set them down with barely a sound, took the empties he had left out, and was gone before the household stirred. The milk was fresh, not ultra-pasteurized, not shelf-stable, fresh from a dairy close enough to deliver it overnight and have it still be cold on the porch at 6 in the morning. The cream rose to the top of the bottle, a pale layer above the white, and you either shook the bottle to mix it or poured it off carefully for the coffee. The glass bottles were returned. They were washed and refilled and returned again. Nothing about this system was disposable. The corner store was not a convenience store in the modern sense. It was a store, usually owned by the family that lived above or beside it, stocked with the things the neighborhood needed, run by someone who knew the neighborhood because they were part of it. The tab was a feature of the corner store that has almost entirely disappeared from American commercial life. You could charge your purchases when cash was short and settle at the end of the week or month. The store owner extended this credit not because of a credit score, but because he knew you. He knew your family. He knew you were good for it. Children were sent to the store alone, a list in one hand and some money in the other, at ages that would now be considered remarkable and that were unremarkable at the time, because the neighborhood was the known world, and the store was part of it. The bread man came on his own schedule, and the bread he brought was fresher than what the grocery store carried because it had not sat in a warehouse for days. The truck smelled of bread in a way that made it impossible to be near without wanting some. The vegetable man came through certain neighborhoods on certain days with a truck full of whatever was in season, and he called out what he had in a voice that carried up to the second-floor windows where women were working, and they came down with their aprons still on and bought what they needed for that night's dinner. Soda came in cases of glass bottles, and collecting empties from the neighborhood and returning them to the store for the deposit money was a recognized source of income for children who understood the economics of it. A wagon load of bottles was a real afternoon's work and a real afternoon's reward. Eating seasonally was not a philosophy, it was a fact. Tomatoes were available in summer. Apples were available in fall. The rest of the year you had what the can could preserve or what the root cellar could hold, and your cooking adjusted to what was there. This made the tomatoes in August something to actually anticipate, and the anticipation was part of the flavor. The glass bottles went back, the cases went back, the bread bag was paper, and the butcher paper was paper, and none of it was designed to outlast its purpose. The neighborhood generated less waste, not because anyone had decided to generate less waste, but because the system was built around return, not disposal. In certain parts of the country, the bakery truck had its own sound, a whistle that carried down the block, and children ran toward it from wherever they were. The man opened the wooden doors at the back to reveal racks of bread and pastries and donuts behind sliding glass panels. The donuts came in a paper bag. The bag was warm. The milkman is gone. The corner store with the tab and the owner who knew your name is mostly gone. The vegetable man no longer calls from the street. What delivery did your family get at the door growing up? Milk, bread, something else? Tell us in the comments. You might mention something the rest of us had completely forgotten.
There was a sewing basket in almost every American home before 1970, and it was not decorative. It was functional the way a toolbox is functional. Stocked with what was needed, used regularly, refilled when supplies ran low. Needles in several sizes, thread in the colors your family's clothes required, a thimble that had been your mother's. Socks were darned, not replaced, darned. You stretched the worn heel over a darning egg, a smooth wooden oval that held the shape while you worked, and you wove new thread through the worn section until the hole was closed and the sock was wearable again. A good darn lasted nearly as long as the original knitting. Children's clothes were patched at the knees because children wore through the knees of their pants as reliably as seasons changed. The patch was cut from fabric saved for the purpose, a piece of a worn-out shirt, a remnant from the sewing basket, and applied with care. A well-applied patch was invisible from a distance and invisible from up close if you were wearing it and had stopped noticing. The button tin was its own institution, a large tin that had formerly contained cookies or hard candy, now filled with buttons saved from worn-out garments before they were discarded. You never threw away a button, you cut it off first. The tin accumulated over decades and became a record of every garment that had passed through the household, each button a small artifact of something that used to be worn. Ironing was not optional. Clothes that came out of the wash went onto the ironing board before they went into the closet. A man went to work in a pressed shirt. A child went to school in pressed clothes. The pressing was not noticed when it was done. It was noticed when it wasn't. When something broke, the first question was not where to buy a replacement. The first question was whether it could be fixed. The toaster that stopped working went to the repair shop or to the man in the household who knew something about how toasters worked, which most men did, because most men had grown up in households where fixing things was expected. The basement workshop was where broken things went to be assessed and, if possible, repaired. The tools hung on a pegboard in the outlines of their own shapes, and the outlines told you at a glance if something was missing and where it belonged when it was returned. Nothing was wasted that could be used again. Rubber bands were saved in a drawer. Paper bags were folded flat. Aluminum foil was rinsed and reused until it could no longer hold its shape. The discipline of reuse was the habit of people who had grown up during the Depression and the war, and for whom waste was not an abstraction, but a failure. Sheets that wore thin in the middle were cut in half lengthwise, the worn center removed, and the two outer halves sewn together so the stronger edges now formed a center. This was called sides to middle, and it extended the useful life of a sheet by years. If you did not know this practice existed, you were reading about a form of domestic intelligence that kept households furnished on budgets that did not allow for frequent replacement of anything. Clothes moved through the family in order of size. An older child's coat became the younger child's coat when the older one grew out of it, and the younger child accepted this without the expectation of something new, because new was for occasions, and hand-me-down was for the rest of the time, and the rest of the time was most of the time. The quilt at the end of a bed was not purchased, it was made, over months or years, from fabric saved from worn-out clothes and sewing remnants, cut into squares and pieced together in patterns that had names: log cabin, wedding ring, flying geese, passed down through generations. The quilt was warm. It was also a record. Every square had come from somewhere. The sewing basket is still in some houses, in a closet or the back of a drawer, too meaningful to discard and too outdated to use regularly. If your grandmother's button tin is still somewhere in the house, tell us in the comments what was in it. What was the most surprising button you ever found in there? We genuinely want to know. The neighborhood was not a location.
It was a community with its own internal logic, its own social contracts, its own understanding of who was responsible for what and what was expected of whom. You knew the people on your block, not to wave to. You waved to people you didn't know. You knew them. Their names, their children's names, their schedules, the sound of their screen door. The fence conversations happened every day. Two women on either side of a backyard fence, each with a coffee cup, talking about whatever needed talking about that morning. Nothing urgent, nothing planned, just the particular kind of contact that happens between people who share a fence line and have decided to be neighborly about it. Children played outside in groups that organized themselves. There was no schedule, no carpool, no parent-arranged playdate. You finished your after-school obligations and you went outside, and the other children were already there, or they came out when they saw you, and the group decided what to do and did it until it was time for dinner. You borrowed from your neighbors and you lent to them in return, and the accounting was kept not in any ledger, but in the general understanding that this was how a neighborhood worked. A cup of sugar when the store was closed, an egg when you'd run out and dinner was half made, a tool that one household owned and another needed once a season. When someone was sick, the neighborhood brought food. Not because anyone organized it or signed up on a list, but because this was what you did, and everyone understood it without being told. A casserole on the porch, a pie left at the door. The food was how you said, "We know, we are here, you are not alone in this." The neighborhood watched itself, not formally, not with meetings or apps, but with the natural attention of people who knew what was supposed to be there and noticed when something wasn't. An unfamiliar car parked too long, a child who seemed lost, an elderly neighbor whose lights hadn't come on by their usual time. The block party closed the street for an afternoon every summer, and everyone came out. Someone brought a grill, someone brought potato salad. The children ran between the adults' legs, and the adults stood in groups that reformed and reformed until evening, when the street was given back to the cars and everyone went home carrying whatever was left of what they'd brought. You helped the elderly neighbor with the yard work or the snow shoveling or the groceries that were too heavy for her to carry from the car. This was not volunteering, this was simply what you did when you were young and able, and she was older, and the snow needed shoveling, and you were already outside with a shovel. When you went on vacation, a neighbor kept an eye on the house. They watered the plants, they collected the mail. The key was given with the understanding that it would be used for nothing except the emergency it was given for, and the understanding held because the neighbor was someone you actually knew, and the knowing was the guarantee. The front porch was where the neighborhood met in the evenings of summer, when the houses were too hot to stay inside, and the air outside was moving, and the day's work was done. Families sat on their own porches and called across to the next porch, and the conversation drifted along the block until dark, when the mosquitoes arrived and everyone went in. You knew the adults on the block by name, Mr. Henderson, Mrs. Kowalski, the Dinopoli family at the corner, and they knew yours, and this mutual knowledge was a form of accountability that nobody had organized or enforced. You behaved differently when the people around you knew your name and knew your parents' names and would mention your behavior if it warranted mentioning. That neighborhood, the one where everyone knew your name and the casseroles appeared when someone was sick and the fence conversations happened every morning, is harder to find now. Not impossible, but harder. Did you grow up in a neighborhood like that? Tell us the name of one neighbor you still remember from your childhood street. Just the name. We'll be reading them all.
Sunday had a shape to it that the other days of the week did not. It began earlier than its leisure implied, earlier because church was early, and church required that everyone be dressed in a way that they were not dressed on any other day of the week. The good clothes, the shoes that were shined the night before. Sunday dinner was the meal the week organized itself around. It was the meal that took all morning to make, eaten at the dining room table rather than the kitchen table, where someone said grace and the food was passed, and there was enough of everything, and everyone stayed longer than usual because leaving was not yet necessary. The Sunday drive happened after dinner, when the dishes were done and the afternoon was available. The family got in the car and the father drove, and the destination was either a general direction, let's go toward the lake, or no direction at all, just driving through neighborhoods and along country roads at a speed that allowed the landscape to actually be seen. The children in the back seat looked out the windows and talked or didn't talk or fell asleep against each other, and the parents talked in the front, in the register of adults who were talking without needing to be heard. There was no destination, because the destination was not the point. The drive was the point. You stopped at the fruit stand if there was one, and in summer there usually was one on any road that passed through farmland. The tomatoes were warm from the sun, the peaches left your chin wet. You bought whatever was ripe and carried it back to the car in a brown bag and ate some of it before you got home. The ice cream stand was the other stop, not planned, discovered. The children spotting it from the back seat, and the parents deciding yes, because the afternoon was warm. Soft serve in a cone, the ice cream melting faster than you could eat it, the cone going soft at the bottom. None of this was a problem. Sunday was also when you visited family, not because you had scheduled it, but because Sunday was when visiting happened, and the family was expected to be home. The cousin you hadn't seen since Easter was there, the aunt who always said you'd grown was there. Someone put coffee on and someone cut the cake, and the afternoon organized itself around the people in the room. The children were sent outside while the adults talked about things that were not for children: money, illness, other people, the particular concerns of a generation that had lived through the Depression and the war. The coffee grew cold in the cups. Someone reheated it. No one was in a hurry. Sunday evenings ended in front of the television. One television, in the living room, watched by the whole family together. Ed Sullivan was on, or Lawrence Welk, or Walt Disney. The children's bedtime arrived somewhere in the middle of the programming, which was itself a form of punctuation, the end of Sunday, the beginning of the week. The Sunday paper was thick enough to occupy an entire morning. The sections were divided by unspoken custom. The father had the front section and the sports, the mother had the society pages and the coupons, the children had the comics, which were in color on Sundays and were the reason children cared about the paper at all. The predictability of Sunday was not a limitation. It was the structure that made the rest of the week bearable. The knowledge that after the work and the school and the obligations, Sunday would come back around with its particular sequence of church and dinner and drive and visit and television and bed, approximately the same as last Sunday's. Where did your family go on Sunday drives? Was there a particular ice cream stand, or a particular road, or a particular relative's house that Sunday meant? Tell us in the comments. Someone else remembers the same road and doesn't know it yet. Before television arrived in the living room, the radio was the center of the house's evening life. The family gathered around it with the genuine attention of people for whom this was the entertainment: the news, the drama, the comedy, the music, all of it coming through a speaker in a wooden cabinet that occupied a place of honor in the room. The radio programs had plots that continued from episode to episode and characters whose voices were as familiar as neighbors' voices. They required you to imagine everything because there was nothing to see. People who grew up with radio drama will tell you that the pictures they made in their heads were better than anything a screen later gave them. The record player let you choose what you listened to, within the limits of what you owned, which was a constraint that made the owning matter. A record you had chosen and paid for was a commitment in a way that a streamed song is not. Your record collection was a map of who you were at the time you bought each record. The board game came out on evenings when there was nothing else to do and the family was all home. The box was stored in a closet, the box worn at the corners from years of handling, the pieces mixed together at the bottom in a way that required sorting before play could begin. The sorting was part of the ritual. Finding the missing piece from the last game was part of the ritual.
Children invented their own entertainment in the hours when they were outside and unsupervised, and the invention was genuine. A stick became a sword or a fishing pole, a cardboard box became a fort. The creek at the edge of the neighborhood was a destination that required no other justification than being there. The library was free and within walking distance, and in the summer, the children's librarian ran a reading program that gave you a chart to fill in and a prize when you had read enough books. The prize was less important than the chart, and the chart was less important than the books, but the structure of it got children into the library who might otherwise have spent the summer entirely outside. The card game was a regular social institution. Women played bridge on Tuesday afternoons, men played poker on Friday nights. The games were the occasion, not the point. The point was the regular gathering of the same people, the conversation that happened around the cards, the particular intimacy of people who have sat across a table from each other for years. Knitting and crocheting and needlework were what women did with their hands while they listened or talked or watched television, and the combination produced objects of genuine utility, sweaters, afghans, dishcloths, while also producing the social contact that the handwork provided occasion for. The work gave your hands something to do while your attention was elsewhere. The family vacation was usually modest, a week at a state park or a drive to the beach town 3 hours away or a visit to relatives in another state. The accommodation was simple and the budget was real, and the constraints of both produced a vacation that required everyone to get along in close quarters, which was its own form of education. Boredom was permitted. Not encouraged, not anyone's goal, but permitted long enough for children to solve it themselves, which they did, usually by going outside and finding someone to play with or inventing something on the spot. The solution to boredom was the child's own problem, and the solving of it was itself a form of development that unscheduled time provides and that scheduled time does not. The 45 was a single, one song on each side, and you sorted your stack by favorite, which was a way of ranking your feelings about things that was visible and physical and could be rearranged when your feelings changed. On summer evenings, the record player was on, and the windows were open, and the music went out into the neighborhood, and the neighborhood led it. What did you do for fun before screens? Not what did your children do, what did you do specifically in the summers of your own childhood before anyone had told you yet that you were supposed to be bored? Tell us in the comments. The best answers are always the most specific ones.
The habits do not leave all at once. They leave the way a season leaves, gradually, then suddenly, in a way you only recognize as departure once it is already departed, and the thing that replaced it is so thoroughly present that you can barely remember what came before. The hand that reaches for a rotary dial and finds a touch screen. The ear that hears silence where the percolator used to be. The morning that begins without a paper on the porch and feels, for a moment, incomplete in a way that cannot be entirely explained by logic. These are not dramatic losses. They are small ones. They accumulate. The glass bottle was returned because it was worth returning. The rubber band was saved because it was worth saving. The sock was darned because it was worth darning. The neighbor was known because knowing them was worth the time it took. The Sunday drive went nowhere in particular because going nowhere in particular was worth the afternoon. These were not sacrifices. They were investments in things, in people, in the particular quality of a life lived with attention to what was actually there. You knew your neighborhood the way you knew your own name, without effort, without consulting anything, without needing to be reminded. You knew the sound of every screen door on the block. You knew which yard smelled of tomatoes in August, and which house had the man who asked how school was going and actually waited for the answer. You were known in return. The knowing went both ways, and it went deep, and it was the structure underneath everything else.
If you grew up before 1980, you grew up inside a way of living that has changed more completely in the decades since than it changed in the decades before. The percolator is gone. The milkman is gone. The operator is gone. The party line and the button tin and the darning egg and the Sunday drive and the fence conversation and the porch call gone or going or kept alive by people who understand what is lost when they are let go. We have not lost everything, but we have lost enough that the people who remember what it was are carrying something the rest of us need. If you are one of those people, leave us one thing in the comments, one specific thing from before 1980 that nobody does anymore. One thing you want remembered. We will be reading every single one.